There is a strange comfort in knowing that billionaires and legendary CEOs regularly make decisions so profoundly stupid they completely bankrupt entire empires. Forget the shiny success stories. We are exposing the ultimate corporate Darwin Awards. From massive companies ignoring the future, to executives literally setting billions on fire out of pure, unchecked arrogance. Two literal Nobel Prize winners genuinely believed they had unlocked the cheat codes to the global stock market. Long-term capital management was their elite hedge fund, built on incredibly complex math that completely ignored one tiny detail. Human beings are deeply irrational. In 1998, their massive brains managed to make bets so catastrophically bad that they nearly vaporized the entire global financial system. The Federal Reserve actually had to panic organize a multi-billion-dollar bailout just to stop a worldwide economic apocalypse. It turns out that having a shiny gold medal does not stop you from acting like a degenerate gambler at a Vegas casino. Genius definitely has an expiration date. 2. Imagine willingly handing the keys to your house directly to a known burglar. That is exactly what Borders bookstores did in 2001. Executives looked at this confusing new thing called the internet and decided they just did not want to deal with it. So, they outsourced their entire online operation to a scrappy little competitor named Amazon. Borders literally handed over their customer lists, their buying habits, and their entire digital future on a silver platter. Amazon happily used that precious data to grow into an unstoppable retail leviathan. Borders, meanwhile, slowly suffocated and filed for bankruptcy a decade later. They paid for their own funeral and even dug the hole. 3. Everyone loves to blame iPads and video games for the tragic death of Toys R Us, but the truth is significantly more sinister and involves guys in expensive suits. A group of corporate raiders bought the beloved chain in 2005 and instantly strapped it to a $5 billion anvil of debt. All the cash that should have gone toward fixing leaky roofs and building a functional website instead went straight to paying off massive loan interest. While they were drowning in Wall Street paperwork, Amazon aggressively ate their lunch. Jeffrey the giraffe was not taken out by kids growing up. He was quietly assassinated by private equity vampires in a boardroom. 4. Tying two sinking ships together does not magically create a luxury cruise liner. Yet that was the exact logic when Kmart somehow swallowed Sears in 2005. A hedge fund manager named Eddie Lampert engineered the massive merger, promising a retail revolution. Instead, he spent the next decade systematically gutting both legendary brands for their real estate value. Shoppers were left wandering through depressing, empty aisles under flickering fluorescent lights, while the companies slowly starved to death. Naturally, both chains collapsed into total ruin. Lampert eventually bought the charred remains out of bankruptcy, and it is somehow still dying today. Some billionaires just treat destroying American institutions as a weekend hobby. 5. The sheer, unfiltered delusion of the dot-com bubble can be perfectly summarized by a single, singing sock puppet. Pets.com burned through a staggering $300 million, dropping an absolute fortune on Super Bowl commercials. Their groundbreaking strategy? Selling heavy bags of dog food at a massive loss and eating the expensive shipping costs. Management honestly believed they would magically make up the brutal losses by just selling a massive volume of items. That is right. They thought multiplying a negative number would somehow generate billions. The company exploded spectacularly in less than 3 years. But that incredibly annoying puppet somehow outlived the business by a couple of decades. 6. Barbie's accountants clearly took an extended vacation in 1999. Mattel desperately wanted to expand beyond plastic dolls, so they dropped $3.5 billion to buy the Learning Company. It was the absolute biggest acquisition in their entire corporate history, and they clearly skipped doing even basic homework. In the very next quarter alone, their shiny new toy lost over $200 million. The financials were a completely toxic wasteland. Utterly panicked, Mattel dumped the entire company off for essentially pennies just 12 months later. Due diligence is not just a fancy corporate buzzword, folks. Skipping it is a fantastic way to light billions of dollars completely on fire. 7. Sugar tastes exponentially better when you actually have to hunt for it. Krispy Kreme completely forgot this basic human psychology between 2000 and 2004. The executives completely lost their minds and aggressively expanded from 140 locations to over 400. Suddenly, you could buy their legendary donuts at random gas stations, sad grocery store aisles, and practically out of the trunks of cars. When you are literally everywhere, you are no longer a special treat. Sales per store absolutely tanked because the scarcity magic was completely gone. They had to frantically shutter hundreds of locations just to stop the bleeding. Overdosing on your own success is a real medical condition. 8. Watching the collapse of WeWork was less about real estate and more like witnessing a perfectly legal bank heist. Founder Adam Neumann somehow managed to casually pocket over $700 million before his own chaotic company completely imploded. He sold off personal shares, took massive loans against his stock, and demanded a gigantic golden parachute during the frantic public offering bailout. While thousands of regular employees lost their jobs and investors watched billions evaporate into thin air, Neumann was busy shopping for luxury mansions. Honestly, you have to respect the sheer audacity. Someone definitely won the giant WeWork game, and it sure as hell was not the people renting the communal desks. 9. Picture a guy walking into your office and offering you a winning lottery ticket for a fraction of its value, and you just laugh in his face. That was the CEO of Blockbuster in the year 2000. A young Reed Hastings offered to sell his little startup called Netflix for a measly $50 million. The Blockbuster executives thought mailing DVDs was just a cute, harmless gimmick and basically showed him the door. Today, Netflix is a global titan worth over $250 billion. Blockbuster, meanwhile, has exactly one sad, lonely store left functioning in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. A relic frozen in ice is the absolute perfect metaphor for them. 10. Hubris is an incredibly expensive drug. In 2007, Nokia was the undisputed king of the world, controlling more than half of the entire global mobile phone market. Then Steve Jobs stood on a stage and revealed the first iPhone. Nokia executives literally laughed out loud, boldly declaring that serious consumers would never abandon physical plastic keyboards for a smudgy piece of glass. Fast forward just 6 brutal years, and Nokia was bleeding cash so heavily they had to sell their entire phone division to Microsoft. Naturally, Microsoft then proceeded to completely ruin whatever was left. Going from complete global domination to an absolute punchline in 6 years is genuinely impressive. 11. Slashing payroll always seems like a brilliant idea until you actually have to run a business. The geniuses at Circuit City had a massive revelation in 2007. They realized their most experienced salespeople were earning decent commissions, so they fired 3,400 of them on the exact same day. Their master plan was replacing those experts with completely untrained, minimum-wage teenagers. Shoppers instantly noticed that the kid trying to sell them a massive home theater system knew absolutely nothing about electronics. 2 short years later, the entire multi-billion-dollar company was dead and buried. They successfully saved a few pennies on hourly wages and completely liquidated a retail empire in the process. Excellent math. 12. Choosing the wrong side in a tech war can get very ugly, very fast. Toshiba bet their absolute survival on the HD DVD format during the brutal high-definition disc wars. They aggressively poured hundreds of millions into massive marketing campaigns, heavily subsidized the hardware, and paid off movie studios. Then, in a completely ruthless ambush, Warner Brothers abruptly switched their loyalty to Blu-ray. That single announcement instantly snapped Toshiba's neck in the market. They lost nearly $1 billion and were forced to hold a highly publicized, deeply humiliating press conference to surrender. Watching those executives formally bow in total defeat was painful, but their quarterly earnings report was definitely much worse. 13. What do you do when a giant online predator is aggressively hunting you? Apparently, you just tie yourself to another slow-moving animal and hope for the best. In 2013, Office Depot and OfficeMax were both terrified of Amazon, so they decided to merge. Management genuinely believed that becoming one massive, heavily bloated corporation would magically solve all their problems. Shockingly, it did not. They just became a significantly larger, much slower target with twice as much completely useless retail space. The combined Frankenstein monster has been continually struggling to survive ever since. When two panicked people are drowning in the ocean, aggressively hugging each other usually just makes them both sink faster. 14. Do not mess with people before they have had their morning coffee. Tropicana completely ignored this rule in 2009 when they decided their classic orange juice carton was just too boring. They hired expensive designers to replace the iconic orange and straw logo with a sterile, bizarrely generic graphic of a glass. The backlash was instantaneous and completely brutal. Sales plummeted by a staggering 20% in a single month because exhausted shoppers literally could not find their juice on the shelf. The company lost tens of millions and frantically switched back to the original design almost immediately. Sometimes, boring, totally predictable packaging is exactly what a tired human brain desperately wants. 15. In 2013, Target decided to aggressively invade Canada by opening 133 massive stores almost simultaneously. It was an absolute logistical apocalypse. Their brand new inventory software was completely broken, meaning these giant retail spaces had totally empty shelves for months. Canadians walked in expecting cheap chic, and instead found post-apocalyptic barren grocery aisles. The company bled over $2 billion and completely abandoned the entire country less than 2 years later. Executive arrogance mixed with terrible supply chain software is a violently expensive cocktail. 16. In 1994, the incredibly boring oatmeal executives at Quaker Oats bought the quirky beverage brand Snapple for a massive $1.7 billion. They immediately ruined everything that made it special. Quaker aggressively tried forcing the funky glass gas station bottles into bulk supermarket aisles, completely destroying the brand's cool, alternative vibe. Sales cratered instantly. Just 3 short years later, a completely panicked Quaker dumped Snapple for a pathetic $300 million. That is a billion-dollar lesson in why conservative oatmeal guys should never try to be hip. 17. Wall Street was absolutely convinced that shipping tiny, individual carrots in massive cardboard boxes was the glorious future of human nutrition. Blue Apron went public in 2017 with a massive $3 billion valuation. The hype was astronomical, but the actual business model was a complete horror show. They spent an absolute fortune aggressively hunting down new customers, only to watch them cancel their subscriptions just 3 weeks later. The company's stock eventually plummeted by well over 90%, incinerating billions in wealth. It turns out that no matter how many microscopic bottles of artisanal soy sauce you mail to people, tired Americans really just want to order a pizza. 18. There is a very specific executive at NBC who probably still wakes up screaming in the middle of the night. Back in 2001, this unnamed genius was given the option to renew the broadcasting rights for Monday Night Football. Instead, they loudly passed on the guaranteed cash cow and chose to heavily invest in launching the XFL. Yes, the wildly chaotic wrestling football hybrid that famously folded after one single, agonizingly embarrassing season. Meanwhile, Monday Night Football moved right over to ESPN and continued printing billions of dollars for decades. Let us all just hope whoever made that spectacular decision was permanently banned from operating anything more complicated than a toaster. 19. Being cheap can be the absolute most expensive mistake you will ever make. British Petroleum decided to get aggressive with cost-cutting on their Deepwater Horizon oil rig in 2010. They skipped crucial safety checks and used cheaper materials just to save a tiny fraction of their budget. Those incredibly thrifty decisions directly caused a massive explosion, 11 tragic deaths, and the absolute worst environmental disaster in American history. The company thought they were being incredibly clever, but the massive cleanup efforts and brutal legal fines ultimately cost them over $65 billion. Saving a few bucks on safety protocols is literally just borrowing heavily from the Grim Reaper at maximum interest. 20. Watching a toxic culture actually face financial consequences is a rare and beautiful thing. The year 2017 was basically a non-stop corporate horror film for Uber. First, massive sexual harassment lawsuits leaked to the press. Then, a highly publicized dashcam video caught the founder screaming aggressively at his own driver. Finally, they got hit with a massive corporate espionage lawsuit over stolen self-driving tech. The public was so thoroughly disgusted that Delete Uber instantly became a massive nationwide movement. Hundreds of thousands of users permanently nuked the app, and the CEO was completely forced out. Turns out, acting like an absolute cartoon villain does eventually hit the bottom line. 21. Twitter actually managed to hold the golden ticket to the future of the internet, and they just set it on fire. In 2012, they brilliantly bought a tiny short-form video app called Vine for $30 million. The platform exploded, creating an entirely new culture of massive teenage influencers. But Twitter executives apparently hated success, so they completely starved it of resources and casually shut it down in 2016. At that exact moment, a little app called TikTok was emerging using the precise same format. Twitter literally owned the direct ancestor of the biggest social media addiction on the planet, and they just put it out of its misery. Absolutely brilliant. 22. You literally cannot discuss stupid business decisions without bowing down to the absolute king of them all. In 1985, Coca-Cola executives stared at the most successful consumer product in the history of human civilization and thought, we should definitely mess with this. They drastically altered the beloved formula to create new Coke, and the American public responded with pure, unadulterated rage. People actually poured it into the streets. The company's switchboards completely melted down with furious callers. They frantically retreated and brought back the original formula just 79 days later. If your product is legally printing billions of dollars, for the love of everything, do not touch the recipe. 23. Just because you have $9 billion burning a hole in your pocket does not mean you should spend it. In 1998, Compaq made massive headlines by purchasing Digital Equipment Corporation. It was the absolute largest technology acquisition of its time. The only tiny issue was that Compaq management had absolutely zero idea how to actually combine the two wildly different companies. The massive integration was a total bloodbath. The corporate structure became so incredibly weak that Compaq itself got swallowed whole by Hewlett-Packard just 4 years later. Dropping billions on a company without a plan is basically just throwing a massive party where only the lawyers get rich. 24. Irony does not get much more painful than the tragic tale of Kodak. Way back in 1975, a brilliant Kodak engineer actually invented the very first digital camera. He proudly walked into the boardroom and showed the executives the absolute future of human photography. Their immediate response? They told him to bury the technology immediately because it might slightly damage their highly profitable film sales. Unsurprisingly, the unstoppable digital revolution happened anyway, led by literally every other company on Earth. Kodak eventually filed for bankruptcy while literally holding the original patents for the exact technology that murdered them. That is a level of self-sabotage that belongs in a museum. 25. Saying no to a billionaire is usually a terrible idea, but sometimes it is the only right move. Back in 1998, a much younger Jeff Bezos approached the founders of a tiny startup called Netflix. He aggressively offered to buy their entire DVD operation for roughly $15 million. To the absolute shock of the tech world, they looked Bezos right in the eye and flatly rejected the massive payday. They chose the hard road and eventually built a completely dominant $250 billion streaming empire. So yes, occasionally, telling Jeff Bezos to take a hike is a fantastic financial strategy. But please remember this is the extreme exception, not the rule. 26. Microsoft completely missed the smartphone revolution, so they decided to aggressively buy their way back in. In 2014, they casually dropped $7.6 billion to acquire Nokia's completely struggling phone division. The grand master plan was to force the world to love Windows phones. It was a failure of truly biblical proportions. Just 1 year later, Microsoft had to aggressively write off almost the entire purchase price and fire nearly 8,000 employees. They essentially bought a massive, famously sinking ship, stood proudly on the deck, and acted completely horrified when their feet got wet. Seriously, even the Titanic had better long-term planning than this deal. 27. Giant shoe companies should probably just avoid the political arena entirely. Right after the incredibly tense 2016 election, a New Balance executive publicly praised the incoming administration for opposing certain trade deals. The internet backlash was instantaneous and violently aggressive. Furious customers started filming themselves literally setting their expensive sneakers on fire, and the hashtag #DeleteNewBalance went totally viral. The panicked executives had to scramble and release deeply embarrassing PR statements desperately claiming political neutrality. It is a harsh but necessary reminder for global corporations. Sometimes just completely shutting your mouth and sticking to making comfortable dad shoes is the smartest thing you can do. 28. In the 1970s, Schlitz was proudly sitting as the second most popular beer in all of America. Then, a wildly greedy executive decided to aggressively cut costs by quietly cheapening the actual brewing process. They swapped out quality ingredients and used a bizarre seaweed extract to artificially stabilize the foam. The actual beer literally became cloudy, went flat instantly, and left a gross mucus-like slime at the bottom of the can. Consumers instantly vomited and completely abandoned the brand forever. They destroyed a legendary billion-dollar brewing empire just to save a few pennies per barrel. 29. The early 90s were an incredibly confusing time for beverage companies. Some absolute genius at Pepsi decided the future of soda was entirely transparent. They aggressively launched Crystal Pepsi in 1992, heavily marketing it as a pure, clean alternative. The massive psychological problem was that it tasted exactly like dark, syrupy Pepsi, but it looked exactly like a glass of tap water. This completely short-circuited the brains of millions of consumers who fully expected a light citrus flavor. The deeply unsettling Invisible Cola was completely discontinued by 1994. Sometimes making your product look like completely different liquids just makes people feel deeply uncomfortable while they drink it. 30. Automotive engineering and Hollywood magic are two wildly different things. When John DeLorean launched his futuristic, stainless steel sports car with gull-wing doors in 1981, the public hype was totally astronomical. Unfortunately, the actual physical vehicle was massively underpowered, wildly overpriced, and suffered from notoriously terrible manufacturing issues. The company completely collapsed in financial ruin just 2 short years later. The car only became a globally beloved cultural icon because a director decided it looked cool enough to be a time machine in Back to the Future. A massive cinematic blockbuster successfully managed to immortalize a vehicle that actual mechanical engineering completely failed to keep on the road. 31. Brand loyalty will only stretch so far before the human brain violently rejects it. The marketing department at Colgate had a truly psychotic brainstorm in the 1980s. They somehow decided that the trusted brand name heavily associated with minty toothpaste should absolutely expand into the frozen dinner aisle. They proudly launched Colgate Kitchen Entrees, featuring meals like frozen beef lasagna. Shockingly, grocery shoppers completely failed to separate the mental image of foaming dental hygiene from a hot plate of Italian food. The incredibly bizarre product died a very quick and highly embarrassing death. Absolutely nobody on Earth wants a fresh, minty aftertaste mixed directly into their microwave spaghetti. 32. Corporate mergers usually look fantastic on paper, right up until the engineers actually have to make things work. In 2005, the cellular giants Sprint and Nextel decided to smash their companies together in a massive $36 billion deal. There was just one incredibly crucial detail the executives completely ignored. Their massive cellular networks ran on entirely different technologies and were completely incompatible. Dropped calls absolutely skyrocketed, and incredibly frustrated customers fled by the millions. Sprint eventually had to write off roughly $30 billion, bringing the company to its knees. It was literally like an incredibly expensive arranged marriage where the couple realizes they do not speak the same language. 33. You can absolutely invent the future and still end up totally bankrupt. Napster essentially single-handedly created the modern concept of digital music streaming. They completely revolutionized how millions of teenagers consumed audio on their slow desktop computers. Their only fatal flaw was giving absolutely everything away for free while completely laughing at international copyright laws. By 2001, furious record labels unleashed a literal army of lawyers and sued the platform completely out of existence. A decade later, Spotify came along and proved the exact same digital model could generate billions, simply by legally paying for licenses. Blatant digital piracy is historically a terrible foundation for a sustainable business model. 34. Arrogance in the boardroom can cost billions. When Hewlett-Packard decided to buy the struggling remains of Compaq in 2002, absolutely everyone warned them. Literally every financial analyst, tech expert, and sane person on Wall Street aggressively screamed that it was a terrible idea. But HP's CEO arrogantly pushed the $25 billion deal through anyway. Shockingly, smashing two heavily bloated struggling hardware companies together was a total disaster. The stock utterly tanked. The board eventually fired the CEO, and the company spent over a decade trying to recover. Here is a totally free tip. When literally everyone in the massive room is screaming stop, you should probably hit the brakes. 35. Sometimes a burger joint just needs to accept its destiny and stay entirely away from the mozzarella. In the 1990s, McDonald's executives suffered a collective delusion and aggressively tried to enter the pizza business. The legendary McPizza was born. The massive fatal problem was that it took a grueling 11 minutes to bake a single pie. In the heavily optimized fast food world, 11 minutes is an absolute eternity. The product completely contradicted the entire concept of a speedy drive-thru. They quietly murdered the menu item nationwide, leaving only one giant, incredibly weird location in Florida still serving it. Stick to the fries, guys. The fries never let anyone down. 36. What works for expensive technology will absolutely destroy a discount clothing store. Retail genius Ron Johnson left Apple in 2012 to completely reinvent the deeply struggling JCPenney. His brilliant master plan was instantly eliminating all the fake sales and aggressive discount coupons. The fatal issue was that JCPenney's entire middle-class customer base existed almost exclusively for the psychological thrill of a red clearance sticker. Sales completely plummeted by 25% in a single, utterly brutal year. The totally panicked board fired him after just 17 months. It turns out that people happily buying luxury iPads are psychologically very different from folks hunting for a steep discount on khaki pants. 37. Ignoring massive technological shifts is basically just volunteering for extinction. For decades, Smith Corona was the absolute undisputed king of the typewriter industry. When the very first personal computers and digital word processors started showing up in offices, their executives famously waved them off as a temporary, incredibly expensive fad. Clinging desperately to their noisy metal keyboards, they marched proudly into total irrelevance and filed for bankruptcy in 1995. Today, their remaining factories barely survive by manufacturing thermal sticky labels for shipping boxes. Going from completely revolutionizing human-written communication to printing barcodes for warehouse packages is quite possibly the most tragic corporate downgrade in American history. 38. Buying a massive social network and instantly banning its core audience is certainly a choice. In 2013, the aging giant Yahoo desperately wanted to seem cool to teenagers, so they dropped $1.1 billion on Tumblr. Then, in a stroke of absolute puritanical genius, they completely banned all adult content. They utterly failed to realize that edgy, unfiltered content was basically Tumblr's entire driving force. Millions of users instantly evaporated overnight. By 2019, the desolate digital ghost town was sold off for a measly $3 million. Turning a billion-dollar investment into pocket change is an absolutely breathtaking 99.7% loss. That takes genuine skill. 39. Silicon Valley venture capitalists will literally fund anything if you put a microchip inside it. Juizero somehow raised over $120 million to build a $400, heavily engineered, Wi-Fi-connected juicing machine. The ridiculous business model relied entirely on selling subscription packets of pre-diced fruit. Then, a wildly curious reporter shockingly discovered you could just aggressively squeeze the proprietary juice packets with your bare hands, completely eliminating the need for the incredibly expensive machine. The entire heavily funded concept collapsed within a year. Somewhere out there, an elite tech investor is still crying softly into his wildly expensive, completely useless, artisanal hand-squeezed celery blend. 40. Pawn shop desperation is never a good look for a massive retailer. As Sears was actively gasping for air in 2017, management made the incredibly grim decision to sell off their legendary Craftsman tool brand. Stanley Black & Decker bought the entire name for roughly $900 million. Sears had literally spent an entire century painstakingly building massive generational loyalty around those specific tools. By selling the rights, they essentially told their last remaining loyal grandpas they could just go buy the exact same wrenches at Lowe's. They pawned off the absolute last of their corporate crown jewels for quick cash and still went completely bankrupt anyway. Pure brilliance. 41. Hoarding tech startups like cheap trading cards is an absolutely terrible long-term financial strategy. During the chaotic height of the dot-com boom, America Online was basically drunk on power and inflated stock valuation. They spent billions upon billions wildly buying up massive companies like Netscape, MapQuest, and the messaging app ICQ. Instead of intelligently integrating them, almost all of these pioneer brands were just left to slowly suffocate and fade into complete digital irrelevance. Just to highlight their brilliant strategy, AOL bought ICQ for over $400 million, only to quietly dump it for less than half that price a decade later. They basically invented the digital graveyard. 42. Back in 1999, the massive internet portal Excite had the absolute golden opportunity to buy a little college project called Google for under $1 million. The Excite CEO famously rejected the deal for the most insane, backward reason possible. He actually thought Google's search engine was way too fast and accurate, which meant users would leave Excite's portal too quickly. So he flatly passed. Today, Alphabet is worth nearly $2 trillion, and Excite is a forgotten trivia question. Punishing a product for being too good is top-tier corporate brain damage. 43. Winning awards for being clever is great, unless you are actively committing massive federal crimes. For 6 consecutive years, the glowing editors at Fortune magazine proudly named Enron as America's absolute most innovative company. They certainly were not wrong about the innovation. It just happened to be entirely focused on highly illegal accounting fraud. The entire massive house of cards spectacularly collapsed in 2001. Top executives were rightfully thrown into federal prison. Thousands of innocent employees lost their entire life savings, and the prestigious accounting firm Arthur Andersen was completely destroyed in the blast radius. It turns out that creative writing definitely does not belong on official corporate tax returns. 44. Basic elementary school math is apparently a very rare skill in the tech startup world. The business model of MoviePass in 2017 felt like it was designed by a wildly chaotic teenager. For exactly $10 a month, you could watch an unlimited number of movies in actual theaters. Meanwhile, the company was paying the theater's full retail price for every single ticket scanned. Anyone with a basic calculator could instantly see this was absolute corporate suicide. They actively lost massive amounts of money on every single customer. They violently burned through hundreds of millions before utterly collapsing, leaving behind a legendary business case study simply titled, "What is Math?" 45. Arrogant stubbornness is basically just a slow-motion corporate suicide note. BlackBerry completely dominated the early smartphone era with their incredibly addictive physical keyboards. When the very first iPhone was unveiled, their top executives scoffed and literally asked if Apple had just squeezed an entire Mac computer into a phone. They stubbornly refused to believe serious business people would ever type on a flat piece of glass. By the time they finally panicked and admitted touchscreens were the actual future, it was way too late. Their massive market share plummeted from 50% down to an embarrassing 0. Mocking the future is a fantastic way to ensure you are not part of it. 46. Success in one area does not magically make you an absolute genius in another. By 2014, GoPro was flying incredibly high with an astronomical valuation of over $11 billion. Drunk on their massive action camera success, they decided to completely pivot and start manufacturing complex aerial drones. There was just a slight engineering hiccup. The expensive drones randomly lost power and literally fell right out of the sky like heavy plastic bricks. They had to issue deeply humiliating mass recalls, and the company's stock eventually plummeted by 95%. They survived the disaster but never regained their former glory. Seriously, rugged little action cameras really do not need to fly. 47. Giant corporations love capitalism right up until they violently crash their own companies. For absolute decades, the wealthy executives at General Motors actively ignored the rising massive threat of reliable, highly fuel-efficient Japanese cars. Instead, they proudly doubled down on manufacturing massively heavy, incredibly gas-guzzling SUVs for the American suburbs. When global gas prices eventually skyrocketed and the economy violently crashed, their massive dealership lots were completely full of expensive vehicles absolutely nobody wanted to buy. In 2009, they had to beg for a massive $50 billion government bailout. Apparently, rugged corporate independence quickly vanishes the second you need the American taxpayers to cover your incredibly stupid bets. 48. Ruining a wildly popular platform with aggressive advertising is a tale as old as the internet. Back in 2005, MySpace was the absolute undisputed king of social media. Rupert Murdoch and News Corp bought it for a massive $580 million. Almost immediately, corporate management ruined the entire user experience by heavily cluttering the pages with annoying banner ads and relentless spam. Frustrated teenagers completely fled the chaos for the clean, ad-free dorm rooms of early Facebook. By 2011, News Corp gave up and sold the digital wasteland for a pathetic $35 million. Losing $500 million in value is not depreciation, it is a crime scene. 49. Hype is an incredibly dangerous drug. Before the Segway officially launched, the public anticipation was absolutely nuclear. Steve Jobs dramatically claimed that modern cities would be completely redesigned around this mysterious device, and Jeff Bezos eagerly invested. Then they finally revealed it, and the entire world collectively groaned. It was essentially a $5,000 profoundly dorky electric scooter, perfectly designed for lazy mall cops and wandering tourists. The revolution completely stalled on day one. In a deeply dark turn of fate, the wealthy businessman who later bought the company actually died by accidentally driving a Segway directly off a cliff. The universe genuinely has an incredibly twisted, ruthless sense of humor. 50. Scamming rich kids on an island is a fantastic way to end up in a federal jumpsuit. The legendary disaster of the Fire Festival promised a luxurious, ultra-exclusive VIP party experience. Instead, influencers arrived at a desolate gravel lot filled with damp disaster relief tents and were fed exceptionally sad cheese sandwiches out of styrofoam boxes. The entire heavily promoted event was a massive, highly documented fraud. Organizer Billy McFarland was rightfully thrown in federal prison for 6 years. Amazingly, he is out now and aggressively trying to sell premium tickets for Fire Festival 2. Apparently, highly ambitious sociopaths just treat a federal prison sentence like a minor networking opportunity. I want to know exactly which of these corporate disasters you personally lived through and suffered from. Did you own a useless Segway or drink that slimy Schlitz beer? Expose your own terrible consumer choices down in the comments right now. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and violently click like so the algorithm knows we only reward highly questionable decisions.